Good morning, everybody. Welcome. It's really kind of you to make time to join us here today for this edition of Care Oregon's Meds Ed. I got a sense from the invites that came in for this particular event that we had a lot of interest and a lot of folks joining us who are first time attendees to Meds Ed. Perhaps even some folks who are from outside of the Oregon area. So I would ask as a favor this morning, if you are from some other locale other than the Care Oregon CCO environments, or even if you are, go ahead and just drop in the chat where you're viewing from today. We'd love to hear where you are, and we'd like to extend our welcome to you wherever you may be. I wanted to give you folks on this slide here, hopefully everyone can see here, an example of what our agenda is breaking down to be here today. After our welcome, you will see that there are several different 90-minute segments that are put together here, and there is a break at the end of one of the first large group debriefs. So expect that to come around before too long. This is generally the structure of how each of these activities will go. Our main presenter today will begin with some didactic, some lecture. Everyone's going to be broken up into a series of small groups today. More about that in a moment. And then after those small groups, we'll all come together for a larger group debrief to discuss things in more detail. So that gives you an idea of what the flow and general rhythm will be like. Here's a glance at our learning objectives that you'll see. Not going to read those all to you right now, but you're going to have all those. And again, don't worry about taking too many notes during of the slides. You're all going to be sent a copy of these slides after the presentation here, along with instructions about how to get your CME credit a number of different ways that's going to be provided here today. There's regular AMA physicians CME credit, Oregon Board of Pharmacy credit, and in particular pharmacists. You have the option to get those 2 hours of cultural competency credit that are now a requirement for this training as well. National Association of Social Workers, and also there is application pending in the wind for traditional health worker and community health worker credit. We expect that to be approved retroactively, but let's not worry about that now. You'll get all that information emailed to you at the end of the session, so it's an easy process to apply for whatever kind of credit that you need. A brief word about this particular Meds Ed. If you've joined us in the past for other sessions, we'd like to just let you know this Meds Ed is going to be a little different in terms of how we do things here. Different in a good way. We wanted this to be as inclusive as a session as possible. So it's really important that you understand that compared to some past Meds Eds, this isn't as much didactic. There won't be as much lecture from a variety of presenters as you've heard in the past, because our co-presenters for this presentation today are you, my friends, all of you. We want this to be something where you feel comfortable and can participate, where you feel this is a good environment, where it's safe to make discoveries together and learn as a group and share your thoughts. So you're going to be just as much of a presenter as our featured speaker here today. I think that's an awesome thing. And we're hoping that our new technology allows that to work pretty seamlessly. It seems like it will. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and say, let's get started. And throughout the morning, if you have questions or anything that you have concerns about, just hit the chat, throw them into the chat there, and we'll be sure to address those for you and keep things rolling. Sound good? I think we should go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and introduce our featured speaker, who I am just thrilled is part of the Care Oregon family. Dr. James Mason is the Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion and HR Officer for Care Oregon. He is the former Chief Diversity Officer for Providence Health and Services here in the Oregon region. He also directed the Office of Multicultural Health for the state of Oregon. He was one of the inaugural founders of the National Association of State Offices of Minority Health. He was a senior consultant and original member of the National Center on Cultural Competence at Georgetown University. He's the president of a diversity consulting and training company that has worked with health systems, professional schools, and programs and related health and human service bureaucracies here in the United States, Latin America, and Canada. How do you find time to sleep, Dr. Mason? That's what I want to know. Working on all these issues of workforce diversity and culturally competent service delivery, I am delighted and thrilled to introduce Dr. James Mason. James, please take it away.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. Appreciate the introduction. often embarrassed when I hear it. I think it means that I've been sleeping. I'm just old. I think that's what that really means. Want to really, before we start, I have to thank so many people. Whenever you do this, you run the risk of missing people, but it's been truly an honor to work with the MedZed team in pulling this together. Ian, Paul, Allende, Laurie, and Kristen have been absolutely, for me, an absolute joy. Um, I'm often anxious before I present, and this is no different. But I think it's performance anxiety, so I believe it's a good thing. I'll know at the end of the day. Um, Paul mentioned the co-presenters, and as I was looking at names of people who were joining, pleased, impressed, intimidated, largely because I know many of you, and many of you could actually be doing this workshop, if not co-presenting, if not leading, which is good and bad. So for many of you, some of this might not be new. However, what I'm going to ask of you in the small group sessions, please use your expertise, your experience, your lived experience to help all of us learn and learn together. Something that I found to be quite profound and often ignored in health systems and networks is when you have providers or if you have helping professionals as part of a team, part of a network, part of an organization, what they often don't get to share are some of their lessons learned. What you hear typically in the hallways, in the meeting rooms, in the break rooms, is what's called gallows humor, which tends to perpetuate stereotypes that we really don't need about now. So I'm going to ask you to bear with this. I'm going to try to make this day as enjoyable and as interactive as possible. Feel free to chat at any point. Um, and looking forward. I'm going to start with ground rules, which seems rather mundane, but I'm really going to suggest to you that when you have to have these difficult conversations, don't be afraid to establish them. Last night, I had some faculty people that I worked with, and I talked about using these in classrooms. That's where I learned to do them, just to make sure the classroom was safe for people to learn, make a mistake, survive it. So today, we're going to be using these rules in this session and in our breakouts. But confidentiality, we're playing by Las Vegas rules. Unless someone's plotting mayhem, it stays with us. Um, we're going to ask us to listen, try to listen to each other, to make sure that we share the airtime. This is what I found to be absolutely positive when facilitating learning, is assume positive intent. The nomenclature around diversity is so dynamic, um, and so contextual. It's so easy to make a mistake. Assume that people mean well. Assume people's intent was honorable. Their impact may be something we need to work on a little bit. Withhold judgment as you think about diversity, as you think about other people's experiences. They may have a belief system, perspective, history very, very different from your own. Something else I would encourage you to do is to question, not only today, but in the course of learning about diversity. Give you a quick example. I have four kids, four for $5, let me know. But when my oldest moved away, went away to school, he came back after school, which was kind of cool. But I had my house to myself. I was single at the time, divorced at the time, and little James came back. Actually, bigger than me, but little James came back. And he was in my house all the time. His friends were in my house all the time. But Saturday mornings were my days. He was going to play basketball, and I had about from 8 to noon to hang out and do whatever I wanted to do. Um, I got up one Saturday morning, went down to the kitchen, and he was in my kitchen. And I was like, damn, James, what are you doing here? And he said, Dad, I live here. And I'm like, I know, but why are you home today? You're not supposed to be here. And he said, his friend, Anthony, Big Ant's whip was busted. And Big Ant is booed up. So Big Ant probably wasn't going to play today. So he's going to be posted at the crib. And the therapist in me did the pensive nod. And the dad in me wanted to call one of the other kids and ask them, what did he just say to me? But I did something really remarkable, at least uh, in that instance. It's actually called ethnographic interviewing. But for a moment, I asked James, what does that mean? And for a moment, he got to be the dad. For a moment, he got to lead. And he told me what the slang meant. And when I learned how to do that slang is when he had friends over and I wanted them to leave, I'd go hang out with them and mess the slang up really, really bad and embarrass them, and they would leave. So just suggesting to you, when you hear cover terms or concepts or jargon or dialect or slang that you don't get, don't resort to the pensive nod. Let someone else lead. Let the relationship become reciprocal for a moment. It helps establish rapport. And if you look at the literature on practice and diversity, you'll see the word relationship, 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 relationship. And that's what we're trying to create in that therapeutic dyad. Um, have fun. Uh, let's not let diversity be onerous. Um, enjoy the songs, enjoy the recipes, enjoy the histories, enjoy people's and cultures' struggles and overcoming those struggles. The world is smaller by virtue of communication, information, and transportation technology. Be a citizen of the world. Now, these are the ground rules I typically use. There's also the one I tend to throw in there around take responsibility, apologize. And those of you in clinical settings, I often encourage clinicians to not be afraid to apologize up front as a disclaimer. So if I'm working with a group that maybe I don't know very well, maybe the Roma community, for example, or maybe the Somali community very well, what I might do is give them a heads up and let them know that as we work today and work together, understand that there are areas that I may not know, may not understand. If I make a mistake, please bring it to my attention. Once a mistake is brought to your attention, you don't get to make that mistake again. You do get to make a new mistake. So life is still good. Um, so with that as a backdrop, I will say let's move forward. And as I said, freely use the chat. And if you're absolutely compelled, go ahead and unmute yourself and blurt something out, and we'll deal with it in a moment. Next slide, please. Um, we're going to start with bias. And this image, many of you have seen it. It's the iceberg of culture notion. And this is the concept that culture is typically 10% visible. There's 90% of culture that is hard to see, hard to discern. How people make decisions, for example, how people define illness and health, which may vary from culture to culture. How people seek help, what people look for in credible providers, what people look for in relevant services, communication style, things like that are often unseen aspects of culture. So uh, it varies, as I said, from group to group. But understand when we look at people and we encounter them, we're seeing just a smidgen of who they really are and how they think and how they operate. Here's the other thing that's nuanced about culture. Culture is to people as water is to fish. I got that from Wade Noble's University of San Francisco some time ago. Um, and what he was suggesting was that if you're part of a cultural mainstream, you may not feel that you have a culture because you're so immersed in it. The easier time to see culture is when you travel. For example, when I've been in parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, I'm American, and personal distance is this far away, arm's length away. I find when people stand closer to me, I'm a little creeped out. I first experienced this teaching after class. Students would come up and ask questions. And typically the international students would be a little bit closer, about a foot closer, and I would back up and they would take a step forward. I would back up, wondering, what are you doing? And they would take a step forward, wondering with me, what are you doing? I would hit the blackboard. It was chalk back in the day, and I would start sliding and erasing the blackboard with my coat. Um, so the interesting thing was proxemics can vary. And again, there's so many ways to make mistakes. Don't feel embarrassed to empower the people you're working with to coach you up a little bit. Here's the interesting thing about that is they're not there to teach you. We have to learn a lot on our own, but they are there and they may be so kind as to coach us up a little bit. Thank them for that, but don't rely on that totally. We're going to start with looking with the idea of bias, and we're going to think about bias in the context of equity and what it means in the sense of service delivery. Next slide. Um, we see a lot of courses on bias, and why is it important? One of the more obvious things is help us manage a diverse workforce. We tend to think of it as creating welcoming environments and hiring managers who understand the bias perhaps of their team or perhaps of their organization, how that might need to be overcome. It's also essential to providing equitable care, um, managing conflict and interrupting discrimination, in the work environment. And as I said earlier, creating welcoming and therapeutic environments. Views of bias and discrimination have evolved. It was once assumed that bias was willful or often explicit. In many cases, it's very implicit and very unconscious. Um, the other thing is that when we think of treatment, uh, it's fundamentally different in that we're not treating everyone the same. We often say that I treat everyone the same. No, we don't, nor should we. A 14-year-old or 64-year-old grandmother, two fundamentally different organisms, if you will. The idea is we give them the same degree of human respect, human dignity, but we might treat them quite differently. Um, so we're trying to transition from an egalitarian era to a more equitable era. Um, and that might require building on cultural strengths and having greater cultural knowledge. Next slide. When we don't address a bias, um, quality of treatment can absolutely be diminished. There may be misinformation, care planning, things of that nature. We tend to lose. Um, it also impacts the way we define problems, how we react to issues, and how we treat everyone. Just want to make us understand that this is critical from a service delivery standpoint. Um, and in a worst case scenario, or at least bad case scenarios, if people feel some intimidation, some awkwardness in approaching us, they delay care. And what I say is they often come to us when stuff is falling off. And falling off isn't a true medical term, at least in my mind it is. But that's when the cost of treatment is a little bit heightened and the effectiveness of treatment might be jeopardized. So again, we want to make sure that we're creating environments that are very, very conducive uh, to keeping people in treatment, enhancing treatment compliance, and assuring that they are more freely and likely to communicate with us. Next slide. And before we get to our value base, in your first activity, in your handout, and I think that's been placed in the chat, there's a form in there called the ID Equity Bias Tool. And just going to run through you a quick way of how we might use it. On the vertical axis on the left are several large groups. I think I have BIPOC or people of color. I think I have people of low income. I think I might have people with disabilities. I know I have LGBTQ. And on the horizontal axis at the top of the chart are the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so when I ask about your ability to be equitable with BIPOC, I'm asking you, are you a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? 1 is low, 5 is high. Understand that when we talk about BIPOC, that's a very large and generalized group. If I were to give myself a score on BIPOC, I'd probably say 3 or 4. If I were to disaggregate BIPOC and I would say Black, for example, I'd probably say 3 to 4. If I were to say Asian, I would say 2 to 3. If I were to think of, let's say, Native, I would probably say 3, and so forth. When I think of LGBTQ, I'd probably give myself a 2 or 3 around L, maybe a 1 or 2 around G, maybe a 1 around T. Um, and again, the idea is that this isn't a static measure. This is to kind of help us understand where we might need to grow. So for example, if I'm finding that I'm low around the T in the LGBTQ, when I go to a diversity conference, as opposed to going where I'm already comfortable, I might attend the T session. If I'm doing from a BIPOC perspective and I see that I'm low in Asian and perhaps Native, I might try to attend those breakouts as opposed to the ones where I'm more comfortable. But when you see that chart in your breakout, basically what I'm asking you to do is do a little self-disclosure, make yourself a little bit vulnerable, but understanding that this is time one. This is time one. And the goal of this chart is to be used over time and to see where you've grown. The other goal of this chart is to see where you're strong. And that's going to be critical. Thanks, Jim. Page 2 of the handout. Um, and so what we want to do is find our competencies and build on those. We don't want to spend a whole lot of time feeling bad about what we don't know. Um, uh, if you don't know your alphabet, feel bad. If you don't know your primary colors, feel bad. The diversity stuff we're all learning in current time, and we're all struggling. And the struggle is okay. It's part of the process. So what I want to talk about now, and something I found to be absolutely critical in this process, is making sure that we help people understand why they do it. And what the literature says is that people and organizations change when the information's in their best interest. Before I knew that, what I would go around the country doing is tell people what cultural competence was, um, and trying to discern what it might mean in a given context or a given discipline or a given population. What I've changed and started doing now is telling people why it's important. And I found if I can build that foundation of it being important to them, it being a value base, they will pursue their own development, their own growth. So the next slide, Paul. So the alignment questions that we will be exploring in our first breakout would, how would you explain your value base for EDI, EDI workforce, an EDI workforce, for a diverse workforce? And how might this discussion, how might your rhetoric vary by audience? How might you explain it to a believer? How might you explain it to a detractor? How might you explain it to a direct report? How might you explain it to a patient? The other thing is a hiring manager. Um, how the other question here is your value base for culturally and linguistically appropriate service delivery. And when we say class, understand that that encompasses cultural competence, cultural humility, cultural responsiveness, and the nuance around the class model, as opposed to the earlier models of cultural awareness. The awareness and cultural sensitivity models were cognitive models. What do I think? What do I know? The class models are more behavioral. What do I do? And so part of the power of our small group discussions are going to be learning what people have done. So again, how do we talk about class and tailor our discussion by audience? Again, what do we say to patients? What do we say to other clinicians, and things of that nature? Um, why do we lead with equity? And what is how does EDI differ from DEI? Um, the Center for Creative Leadership has talked about equity being an important starting point just to begin to understand how people are vulnerable. Um, that if we want to eliminate systemic barriers, we have to really be able to discern how groups and subgroups are vulnerable. For example, we know that language is a health determinant, let's say, for immigrants and refugees. It's less of a determinant for third generation. Um, and we often see this kind of abuse when we have a history of using kids as interpreters and things of that nature, or family members as interpreters, which has been problematic. But we lead with equity because we think equity informs our work. We think understanding how people are vulnerable informs how we roll out diversity and inclusion. So at Care Oregon, we do EDI, um, uh, and we have a rationale as to why. I've also heard DEI, I've heard DNI, I've heard IDE. They're all iterations of the same concept. How do we behave in the context of difference? Next slide. When we think of health equity, it's very, very basic. And one of the interesting things about health equity in the state of Oregon, many of you have seen that OHA has really emphasized the importance of health equity with respect to how we will operate in the next few years. I'm really proud that they're leaning into it, and I would argue that the OHA, like the rest of us, are all learning. So I'm asking us to show ourselves a little grace with respect to this. I'm also asking us to try to be respectful of some of the accreditation bodies, some of our funding bodies, some of our payers who are also on this journey simultaneously. Um, when we think again of health equity and we think of determinants, we typically think of housing, education, geography, language, culture, history, politics, things of that nature. Understand that they can vary by population, they can also vary by region. And one of the things that's interesting from a Care Oregon perspective is we operate in three major regions in the state, even though we operate in the entire state. Southern Oregon, primarily Jackson County, the North Coast, the Tri-County area, and the metro area. When we think of health determinants, they can vary by those regions, and we just want to be sensitive and not do a one-size-fits-all concept when we think of equity. And similarly, when we think of the diverse groups we serve, we don't want to use a one-size equity lens fits all for LGBTQ or BIPOC or anything of that nature. It requires a little bit of sophistication when we think of health equity. Next slide, please. Diversity means variance. It means difference. It's not really rocket science. Um, and the difference can be based on race, ethnicity, age, generation, veteran status, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, any number of factors. And then the interesting thing about this is that people typically aren't one-dimensional. And that's something we're all grappling with as well. Next slide. Inclusion is just the management of that diversity, making sure that people are able to operate at their fullest, making sure that the environment accepts them, encourages them, promotes them, and things of that nature. So when we think of EDI, very simple definition, but defining it is critical to your journey. Not to say that there's one definition, but understanding how people roll this out and how people define it, I think would be helpful to you as a professional. Um, and also being able to explain it to people is also going to be helpful for us, particularly as people leaders and thought leaders. Next slide. This is, and I'm sorry that the print is small, but this is some of the rationale for EDI and service delivery and class. Um, Response to the changing demographics in Oregon and outside of Oregon, we've seen dramatic demographic changes. I've been in Oregon a little bit over 30 years, and I think when I came here, the Black population was 35,000. It's upward to 70,000 now. And there's a reason for that. I think the Latino population was around 30,000. It's almost multiplied by 10. The Asian population, Asian Pacific Islander population, has also grown rather dramatically. The native population has remained rather stable. That's been somewhat of a concern. Um, we've also seen people come from various parts of the country, which is kind of an ongoing and dynamic reality. And we've seen people come from Eastern Europe who look white, but they're not white like the rest of us, if you know what I mean, wink, wink. So we want to be able to discern who people are. And one of the really cool things that has happened in recent years in the state of Oregon is now we're required to collect those data on people's identities and how they see themselves so that we can begin to ensure that we're providing care in equitable fashion. Um, Next slide talks about understanding cultural values, acknowledging cultural. I'm sorry, go back for one. Um, uh, and this slide is misnamed. This is actually the class rationale for class. Uh, but the third bullet there talks about disparity reduction. Um, it has inherent value for us and the people and our members and the people we serve, but it also has a benefit for our organization. We think that as disparities are reduced, there might be a premium in terms of how we're compensated. It promotes better access and utilization. We want to make sure that when we think of class, we want to make sure our environments are safe and welcoming so that people come early on in their process and are more likely to comply with treatment. Um, it addresses our formal and informal education. When I was at OHSU for a few years, and even after I left, I would typically go up there annually and do a 3-hour presentation for their aspiring professionals. And that was typically the most intense dose of diversity that they got. Um, while that seems small, if we were to turn the clock back 20 years, often that wasn't even offered. Not at OHSU, but generally in medical education. We're doing a lot better now. Um, but we often, if we don't find ways to offer that training, offer that education, our hard drive, our intellectual hard drive gets kind of filled with information that might not help us. And then our social learning is often not very, very helpful. And interestingly enough, I do this one exercise where if we were interactive, I would ask the women to give me the negative stereotypes we hear about women and men aren't allowed to play. And within 30 seconds, I would get 10 to 15 negative stereotypes, and you can almost guess what they are. When I ask the women to give me the cultural strengths associated with women, in the same amount of time, I'll get one, two, or three. And so, interestingly enough, what we tend to know about diverse groups is what we think is wrong with them. We know the deficit model. That's why the cultural competence model surfaced, quite frankly. But what's on our hard drive is the deficit model. And we want to be careful that we can find ways to learn about the diverse groups we serve in terms of their cultural strengths and resiliencies so we can build on those, just like we're building on our own. Accreditation, funding, and licensure is another reason we do this. If we look at the state of Oregon, OHA is really ramping that up a bit. Even in your own disciplines, whether it be pharmacy, DO, uh, um, any other mental behavioral health, we're seeing that ramp up. Understand that that's going to increase. Um, Also, the reason we pay attention to this is it elevates and makes visible the determinants that might get in the way, and it helps mitigate some of those negative images that we have of people. It also recognizes that diverse groups are underrepresented in the profession and decision-making bodies that we have, reduces liability and malpractice, upholds our legal obligations to respect people's civil rights. It elevates customer, patient, and community satisfaction, which is a real critical one, and ensures alignment with our mission, values, and the concept of justice. But this is why we might lean into uh, uh, class from a theoretical or um, a rationale for doing so. The next slide is looking at the workforce. Um, why we want a diverse workforce, organizational efficiency. When we have a welcoming environment, we tend to retain people. Um, Voluntary terminations cost the U.S. about $64 billion a year, according to Indeed. It also acknowledges talent and demographic reality. We will be recruiting from diverse bodies of people as we move forward. It enhances employee satisfaction. They're likely to stay. Here's the interesting thing about retention. It's kind of easier to recruit, harder to retain. And the more competent the professional is, the more likely they can leave if they feel slighted. It sparks resource and business development, having diverse people in the equation. It promotes awareness and of underrepresented groups. It increases creativity and productivity. It improves identification and problem solving ability. It elevates workforce and organizational appeal. Again, Indeed is weighed in, as has various other bodies, uh, that a lot of young people are looking to work in diverse environments. Um, and so that becomes an appeal in that way. So it makes our organizations more marketable, more appealing. It makes us as professionals more marketable, more appealing. And again, it promotes access to treatment and treatment compliance. And it might be aligned with our mission. Next slide. Again, 5 benefits of DEI, uh, Indeed. Uh, Expanded creativity and problem solving, better decision making, increased profitability, enhanced employee engagement retention, and better company reputation. So when we think of our rationale for EDI, what motivates you? How is a people leader? How is a provider? How do you explain it? And I think those handouts are also in your packet if you need to refer to them. Next slide. This is another way of looking at it. There's a moral and social justice case. In many instances, when I've gone on the road, people said they had a business case for diversity. A business case for diversity isn't something you can take to a town hall. That isn't going to endear you to a community you're trying to serve. I tend to think the business case has more relevance for Procter and Gamble, for Lockheed Martin, for GM, for shareholders. For us, we have to have other arguments, a moral or just a social justice case. An economic case is probably as close as we're going to come to a business case. The market case, the results case. Again, what motivates you and how would you explain it to others to get them on the bandwagon? So the next slide, I think, is a precursor to our break. Next slide, Paul. Okay, here's a breakout activity. But before I explain the breakout activity, wondered if there was anything in the chat that we want to respond to. Oyenda, Paul, you see anything?
Have not seen any questions come through yet, James. It's seeing a lot of folks who are being just very attentive.
Okay. Again, question at any point, and if I say something you don't get, as I said, don't presume it to be deep or profound. It's just unclear. Let's unpack it. Let's figure it out. But as you go into the small group, you're going to look at the ID bias tool. And I think Jim said that was on page 2, and thank you for Jim. Um, and when you think of this, and I talked about it in the context of yourself, but if you wanted to go deep with it, which you might begin to wonder, whereas I'm a 2 or 3 with African Americans, I think my organization is a 3 or 4. If I'm a 4 or 3 with LGBTQ, my organization might be a 2 or 3. Don't be afraid to discuss it in that context. We can also discuss it in the context of our discipline. Last night I was paying attention to oral health in a workshop, and we wondered about oral health's response to diversity. And it has some areas where it needed to grow. So we can think about this from an organizational standpoint. And again, don't be afraid to disaggregate the large categories of BIPOC or LGBTQ and discuss it in that context. Here's the other thing I wanted you to play around with as in a small group is describe what drives your concern for equitable, diverse, and inclusive workforce. Why is that cool? Um, Culturally linguistically appropriate service delivery, cultural competence, cultural humility, cultural responsiveness. How do you explain that? And how might your message vary by audience? From a workforce standpoint, what might you say to a hiring manager about the concept of fit? To a fellow a clinician who might say, well, I'm not going to capitulate to BLM or the clamors of these diverse people, how might you explain it to that person who may be a naysayer? A patient who might be wondering why we're asking their race or ethnicity. A funder or a payer. And when I say funder or payer, I'm also talking about potential um, grant makers or philanthropies. So I think we have around 30 minutes to play around in our small group. Going to ask you to pay attention to the ground rules. Want to make sure that we create a safe environment. I think there's some facilitator tips in the handout packet as well. And I'm going to ask each group to identify a facilitator and a note taker. The facilitator is just going to try to make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. The note taker is going to take notes and report back. And here's something that I would suggest why note taking isn't a bad role is because you don't necessarily have to feed back, right? What you can do is you can just throw someone under the bus by saying, you know what, in our small group, Paul said something really, really cool, and just throw Paul under the bus like that. Now, Paul will be forced to speak and share his nugget. Paul might resent you for forever, but hopefully it's not someone you'll see again. In any event,
I'm not like
as,
that, James. Come on.
as you guys break into your small groups, let's not make it onerous. Let's keep having fun. Um, I think we're going to do it randomly, and we'll bring you back in around 30 minutes. And if you have questions, we'll address them then. And as again, let's not be so concerned about asking a PC question. Let's ask some authentic questions. Let's display some candor. And if it's a little rough around the edges, we got sandpaper. We can fix it.